The role of the advocate in this country is not to assist defendants to present a false defence. So we are not allowed to preside over the situation that Ian's mentioned, where the defendant wants me, the advocate, to make up the defence for them or to help them to produce a false defence. I'm not here to be in a situation where you're cross-examined by the prosecutor and you then say, oh, but this isn't what my barrister told me to say. So that's the practical reason why we wouldn't do it. So, well, more experienced defendants know the game, and they will know that their advocate can't help them to push a false defence. So they know that part of the game is that you never admit the thing to your barrister before you put your plea in. The experienced ones will say they know that they have to pretend to the advocate that they're not guilty. They won't say, look, I'm actually guilty, but I'm going to plead not guilty, and I want you to present the case as if I'm innocent. The less experienced defendants would have to be warned. If they blurt out the fact that they're guilty, they want to pursue a false defence, the defence advocate has a choice to make. And this is the advice that they would have to give. They would say, as you've already admitted that you're guilty to me, I can only defend you from now on the basis, on a very limited basis, I'm allowed, as the advocate, to test the case for the prosecution, provided I don't make any assertions through the course of cross-examination or my speech to the jury, or any submissions I might make, legal submissions, to arguments I might make to the judge, that I don't make an assertion that in any way implies that you're innocent. So I can't say, for example, in cross-examining a witness, the defendant never assaulted you. It was you that assaulted the defendant, and he was only acting in self-defence. If they say that it was an unprovoked assault. Or if the defendant says, I was the person, but I want you to say I'm not the person who did it. You can't say, if you're testing the identification evidence, where the person says that they picked out the defendant on a video identification parade. You can't say to the defendant or put to the defendant that you've got it wrong, you've made a mistake. All that you're able to say is, you can't even say, are you sure? That's a difficulty, because you're implying that he might not be the person. So your hands really are very tied here, because you have to try and test the evidence in a way that doesn't make any kind of raise any implication that the person might be mistaken. And so you'd have to say to the defendant who is wanting to push your defence, I can act for you as your advocate and test the evidence for the prosecution, but I warn you that my hands are going to be tied, and it might be better, however, therefore, if you didn't use me as your advocate, you go to somebody else, you keep your mouth shut next time and don't say, I'm guilty. That's how you have to do it with...
So in that case, you decide not to take the case because the gentleman says, I did it, but I want to plead.
Yeah, and the trouble is that if
to someone else you now know, or at least have been party to this admission, and then the case is played out with another barrister. Well, what happens?
What happens then is that you see that because the barrister is instructed by a solicitor, as you know, solicitors get the case in the first instance. They then instruct an advocate. Nowadays, there used to be the fine distinction between barristers and solicitors. Only solicitors prepared the case. Barristers was the advocate, the trial advocate. But of course now, so many solicitors have all the rights of audience, all the rights that barristers have to act, and they can even wear wigs in the Crown Court. So there's not the distinction there. But if the client makes an admission to me, strictly speaking, I should say to the solicitor, he's made an admission to me, and I'm professionally embarrassed because he wants me to fight the case, and I can't fight it because he wants me to push his dishonest defence. I can't do that, so I'm handing the case back. What I would do, I think, in those circumstances, I would say to the solicitor, I'm professionally embarrassed. And the solicitor say, well, why are you professionally embarrassed? I can't tell you because you'll be professionally embarrassed. Yeah. So they would say, I don't want to know why you're professionally embarrassed. So you just have to hand it on and say, well, I can't, sorry, I've just discovered that I'm going to be, I'm doing gardening next week. And that's what these solicitors would do if they decide that they can't act for the defendant because defendant's made an admission. You've told me you're guilty and I cannot now therefore represent you in the full-blooded way that you want me to do. And so you better go to another solicitor.
I'll get that same response.
Well, they better have to be careful next time that you don't blab. Yes, it could technically be the case that every time he goes to a new solicitor and fails to follow the advice of the previous one in keeping his mouth shut and saying, I'm innocent, I didn't do it, and doesn't make an admission, every time that happens, he fails to follow the advice, he will go through every solicitor in the country, work his way through, and every time they will say, I'm professionally embarrassed. Yes, that could theoretically happen, but it never does happen. What one does if one is less than fastidious about this is that when the person starts to make an indiscretion in the privacy of the room in which you are, you would do things like you sort of say, no, say no more, shut up. Unless a person is really stupid, some of them they are pretty stupid and they might do what you said, they will get the point and they will withdraw whatever they said, and the barrister or the advocate will have a very short memory of what had just been said. And so we rarely get to the position where we have to tell our instructing solicitors that we've been stupidly what's the opposite of deaf? We've failed to be deaf, stupidly failed to be deaf at the moment when it was needed. And they'll get annoyed, the solicitor will get annoyed that you've put them in this position and never use you again.
Speaking of pleas, can a defendant change their plea, for instance, during the course of a trial?
Well, they can change it to guilty. Yes, of course, that will happen. It happens all the time. The evidence gets stronger and stronger. The defendant is advised by his advocate that the evidence, as you can see, Mr. Smith, the evidence has got stronger and stronger. I advise you at this point that you've no choice here. If you want to have any prospect of any leniency from the court, don't spin it out any further. You will be convicted by the jury and your position will be perilous. And I can give you a recent case in where I gave advice that the defendant failed to follow, and in the end, the advice I gave, proved to be. The advice I gave was borne out by the way the case developed, and he had no choice to be convicted. Now, I can tell you a little bit about the case. It's quite an interesting case. It was a case of what's called aggravated burglary. It's more than just burgling entry. It's like robbery, effectively, but it's worse than robbery because you go into the house, and in this case it was alleged that the intruders armed themselves with a stick. They ransacked the property, took the belongings, and they left. The victim called the police came. An eyewitness who was walking near the house said he saw the intruders come out of the house and they went round the corner and they got into it. His ultimate statement he made described the vehicle as a powerful white sports car. The police put out a warning to their various patrol cars that there had been a burglary and that the car was heading in a particular direction. Just so happened, a patrolling police car saw a white Mercedes drophead at high speed, so they decided to follow. And then they got a report that there was a white sports car that had been seen at about the time would have been taken to get from Palmer's Green to Henley's Corner. So they decided that this could be the car, just by chance. So they followed the car and they flagged it down, the car stopped. Then they found in the car a walkie-talkie, those things that, two-way, which the burglars like to use, because you can't get picked up on, it's not like using a mobile phone. Mobile phone evidence is very strong evidence. They all use all the time in cases to locate people and to get their descriptions. A walkie-talkie is a very simple device, so they arrested them. And then police found that there was a tracking device on the car, and the tracking device was analysed, and it was found that during the course of the burglary, this Mercedes was parked round the corner, virtually where the witness said it was. It got into the car throughout for an hour before the burglary, and left within moments of the time that was given by the eyewitness. But this is where it gets very interesting. There were strong suspicions that these two men, my client and the driver, the other man, were involved in the burglary. It wasn't clear whether they were actually intruders. It could have been, but there was, the very strong evidence of being strongly implicated in this because of the tracking device. The victim of the aggravated burglary said that the men were in the premises. They entered the premises at 8:50 p.m. and they were there for 10 minutes and then they left. Okay, so it was 9 o'clock when they left. The eyewitness who saw the men come out of the house said that it was 9 o'clock when they came out of the house. So he knew it was 9 o'clock. A neighbour opposite had a CCTV system. She said that when she looked at the CCTV, it gave the time of departure of the people as 9:07. The tracking device showed that the car left at 9:09 p.m. And it would have taken them about a minute for you to walk round to where they were running round, the intruders, and got into this car. So it was as near as damn it on the CCTV to the time of departure. When the police tried to get the CCTV, there was a problem with it with them being able to view it. So they said they didn't have any of the CCTV footage. All that they had was the woman's evidence of what she saw on the timing of the departure. And that's all she had. So my advice to my client, they said, we want the CCTV. This will show that we were not the intruders because of what we were wearing. I said, but it's very poor quality, and it's bound to be. The usual CCTV imagery is very poor. If we get this, it may well show the timing on the, as she says, as 9:07, and that's very close to the time on your tracker. My advice is don't go for this. You've got two witnesses who both give the departure at 9 o'clock. Yes, it may be the jury will think, well, they could be wrong about that, but you've got 9 minutes difference between what they say and the tracking device. It could be white sports cars are not that uncommon. It could be any old sports car you could have left, and the actual intruders, nothing to do with you, could have left earlier, and they had a reason why they were there, an relatively innocent explanation. Actually, they said they were visiting a prostitute, around the corner. I say relatively innocent, Anyway, so that was how it stood. I said, don't get this. If you get this evidence, there are two things that will happen. If she's right about the timing, let's assume that she's right about the 9:07 on her CCTV, we might be able to show there's no evidence that this was linked to GMT, that it was actually, that this is real time. It could have been an error. If you call if we insist on this CCTV being called, it could show the time, for example, of the arrival of the police. What happens is that when they arrive at a scene, they press a button and that shows when they've arrived at the scene. So that way they are able to show exactly when they attended. And that could be linked to the CCTV. And we don't have any evidence about the CCTV. It doesn't show anything. The likelihood is it will not show you to be whether or not you're the intruders or not. It won't be good enough for that. No, we want the CCTV. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, have to follow our instructions. So we asked for it to see whether it could be analysed. And in fact, we were able to produce. They did produce the imagery by having interrogated, and it was eventually produced. And it showed a couple of interesting, the figures that would, as we predicted, you couldn't tell whether it was them or not. Interestingly, it did show a white sports car going past very slow speed, past the house, and it was a cul-de-sac, and then coming back at high speed a minute or so later, and that was about significantly before the burglary. The tracking evidence showed that the sports car we had never gone down that street. Oh, they were so jubilant. So all it shows is there were two sports cars, and indeed something the prosecution missed was that there were two, that on some an ANPR, automatic number plate recognition camera, showed a convoy of 3 white sports cars, and the prosecution never picked this up. It was amazing that they were so sloppy about the case. And maybe it wasn't the one that they got into, but the point is that it could well be the one that they got into. Could be, if it was at 907 rather, that's consistent with it being your car that they got into. Don't go down that road, I said. No, anyway. So what happened was that it was produced, and then, yes, it showed the timing of the police arrival was exactly correspondent with the CCTV for this woman's house. To the minute, it showed the police arriving, and that was exactly the time on the police arrival. So that proved that the timing was correct. And had they followed my advice and not pursued this CCTV, when it came to the evidence, the victim, the complainant, said, what time, you said in your statement they broke in at 8:50. You were very sure about it. Are you sure about that? Yes, absolutely sure. It was at 8:50. And you said they were there for 10 minutes. Yes. I said, are you sure about it? Yes, absolutely sure. It was 10 minutes that they were there. By saying, you're trying to they know that what you're trying to do is trick them up by saying that, if are you sure about it? That you obviously want them to be, the evidence to be different. But obviously I wanted it to be exactly what he said in his statement. Did the same thing with the eyewitness, because you know how these witnesses will always, they'll always do exactly, it's reverse psychology. So the witness says, the eyewitness, is it possible it might have been late? No, it was absolutely 9 o'clock, absolutely. I know it because I was watching a TV program, blah, 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 blah. So fine, thank you very much. The prosecutor and the judge were really worried, and the judge was all set to throw it out on that basis, as he indicated. We said, you've got no choice here, you're completely and utterly, and we used an Anglo-Saxon 4-letter word to emphasise the strength of the case against him and their predicament. But the evidence was overwhelming, and at that point they had absolutely no choice but to plead guilty on the basis that they weren't the intruders, they were merely the lookouts, as if that would make any difference to the sentence. But in fact, they got an indication from the judge that on the basis they pleaded guilty to simple burglary because they didn't know that a stick was being used by the intruders. That would be acceptable to the prosecution. So they were very lucky. They actually, first of all, had they followed my advice, they would have got off, because there was once it was proved that there was a 9-minute interval between what the witnesses said was the time of departure and the time of the tracking device. There was that was a 9-minute window that could have been explained by being a different car. They thought that the CCTV would show that they were not the intruders because it would show their clothing, and they weren't wearing that clothing at the time of their arrest. But it was too fuzzy to show anything of the sort. It just showed dark clothing, which is neither here nor there. It didn't show faces. It was far too indistinct for that. So it was a complete. We advised them repeatedly not to go for this. The prosecution said that we presented what's called a basis of plea. That is exactly what we had done, and the basis of plea that was offered wasn't necessarily accepted by the prosecution. But my client said that I told him that it was accepted. And I obviously hadn't done that, because if it had been accepted, I would have told him, I would have written it down and got him to sign it. So I didn't tell him anything. But he claimed the only reason he pleaded guilty was that they were accepting every part of the basis of plea. And so I'd lied to him. I said, well, look, if you're going to carry on saying I'd lied to you, that's the end of the road for me. I'm not carrying on with you. I refuse to represent you any further. If it's clearly professionally embarrassed to be called, being accused of lying when you've refused to follow my advice all the way through the case. So I parted company in that case, and they got 3 years. They would have got they got 3.5, or was it 3.5 years? They might have got away with as little as 2 years had they not been stupid and accused me of lying and whatnot. I mean, they put up this whole thing about visiting this brothel around the corner, so we had to get the police to go and investigate that. Well, apparently there was something, because they got a whole lot of they produced social media messages to show there was somebody operating there. So we knew that there was a prostitute at this place. Whether they actually knew this or they'd researched it for cover, they probably did that. They probably found out that would be their defence if they were found out. So we had the whole spectacle of this very nice woman detective sergeant. She was a really nice woman, very, very helpful and very diligent, going to this address and having, to say, "Excuse me, is this a brothel?" They're saying, "Ugh," They didn't think that the evidence that the two witnesses, the complainant and the eyewitness outside, that it happened at 9, that they left at 9 o'clock, would stand up as, But I said, I can assure you that I will get them to agree, to stand by what they said. No, they didn't believe that I would be able to do that. They said it'll be too up in the air. It's too close in time. It's much better that we have, we have the images of us wearing, dark clothing that isn't the dark clothing that, that we were wearing. What would you do with such people?